Hello, everybody, and welcome to the session of Artfluence, the Human Rights Festival. It is an absolute honor to be chairing today and facilitating this conversation. My name is Lavinia Jones, and the description of today's talk is in the face of funding decline, there is a dearth of cultural leaders to manage arts organizations. Despite this, independent cultural leaders still emerge. And we're with some of them today, which is very exciting. How are today's cultural leaders working with minimal funding? How do they create projects that inspire and lead? And how do these leaders inspire and support the creation of new work that inspires people to engage with human rights through art? There is a lot to cover in today's conversation. And we were all together yesterday discussing some of these themes, and there are many rabbit holes to go down. So I do hope that we're able to really do this very broad topic justice today. So without further ado, I would like all of you to please introduce yourselves to the audience. Can we go with ladies first? Sana and Faye, Kensani, Pokeng, in that order, that would be great.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat today. My name is Sana Junwala. I'm an Indian Zambian curator and photographer, and I'm also the founder of Everyday Lusaka and Zambia Belonging. These are both platforms that look to positively counter the stereotypes we see of African countries through photography. And Zambia Belonging is a project under Everyday Lusaka, which looks at making space for how we can use photography to better represent all the identities and all the people that identify as Zambian. Today, looking at archival photography, collected photography, and found photography from studios in Lusaka. So yeah, that's one particular project that really explores the complexities of identity politics, and that's what I'm interested in.
Hi, my name is Faye Kamarikagwa. I call myself a cultural curator, an arts coordinator, and a writer. So I currently work for Acetage South Africa, which is an international theatre organization that specializes in theatre for children and young audiences. But I'm also somebody who really is interested in the intersection of identity, accessibility, and public engagement. And I've done a number of projects exploring that in various capacities. And in 2020, I was inspired by WhatsApp in particular, and how we can include audiences in the digital space, but also to make it more performative and more storytelling driven. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Kensani Mkari. I call myself a post-disciplinarian, but formally, people know me as an artist and a curator. I stay in South Africa. I'm an educator also. My work primarily focuses on adapting Bakongo cosmogonies within art and curatorial practice.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pokeng Sedai.
Yeah, thank you.
That's okay. There was a delay. Excuse me. I think I can go now. My name is Pokeng Sedai. I'm currently living in Cape Town. I'm a cultural worker who is currently in the process of finishing their doctoral dissertation. And I'm just interested in cultural models, artistic practices, how people make things happen, how they make them happen. And yeah, I'm just here. I'm so glad to be amongst you guys, and thank you for the invite.
Amazing. Thank you all for your introductions. I'm fascinated by a number of the themes coming out of this topic, and certainly every single one of you bring a huge amount of experience, art making, provocation, and deliberation within your work. You're all pushing boundaries in different capacities. You're shaping the future in many ways through your art, through your questions, through your curiosity. And there's no doubt that it's tough out there. And we all know how challenging and how difficult the landscape is to be a full-time maker or artist of any discipline. And we know that certainly in the last 2 years, but it's even beyond the last 2 years that we have seen a very different shaping of arts funding or arts support in not only South Africa, but certainly across the continent and actually globally. That does a whole lot of things, and it shapes the story and the narrative in various ways. Before we go to look through the resource lens, I'm really interested in this word or these words, cultural leader, and how someone identifies or doesn't identify with cultural leader, how all of you sitting in your various spaces relate to that term, and what that means for you as individuals. In preparing for this and through the work that I've done over the years, I've very blurred, compartmentalized cultural leadership in different ways. And one is particularly around the cultural leader in which it's bestowed upon you. You are a cultural leader by your birthright or your heritage and your tribe, as well as your practice. A second one is to lead and shape culture, which is obviously ever changing. The more things change, the more they stay the same as well. So as we develop, as we innovate, as we move, there is a cultural leader who is provoking and who is making art that is challenging stereotypes. And then there is a cultural leader through occupation, a title, perhaps. And that particular kind of cultural leader is, I would say, a very Eurocentric response to cultural leadership. And yeah, so there is a whole multiple different ways to look at this term, cultural leader. You have all been brought together on this panel as identified by others as cultural leaders in your own right through what you do in the world. And so let's start here. Let's start at this place, how you identify with this through your making, through your doing. Is this a comfortable word for you? Is it uncomfortable? And how do you engage with just the concept that you might be provoked? Well, I'm sure you're all quite comfortable with provocation, but how you might be leading through your art making or through your mechanism. And I can go on here. So if anyone would like to jump in with some thoughts about this question of identity with a culture as cultural leader.
Yeah, thanks, Lavinia. I mean, I feel very strongly that culture is something that is embedded within a community. It comes from community, right? So when we're talking about culture, it's traditions, it's ways of being, it's ways of existing in the world, it's practices that are passed down from people to people to people. And so when you're talking about being a leader within a cultural space, it has to somehow it has to kind of emerge organically in some way. And so I'm hesitant to necessarily call myself a leader in that capacity, unless also we're looking at mass mobilization. And so somebody, for example, in the theater and literary space that I think is quite interesting or has been quite influential and therefore a leader would be somebody like Koleka Putuma, who created her first anthology of poems, did a national tour by herself, sold thousands of copies. That work has been translated into 3 or 4 international languages, and I think that is although she did it for her, you could say she did it for her own work, that is an example of leadership because it is her work that is somehow being owned and shared by other people. And so that's kind of like my take on what cultural leadership is and how it moves and expands. And I think maybe it would be interesting to hear from Kensani, because our conversation yesterday, he was talking about us being in some sort of moment. And I think that that's what culture is, right? Like selecting different voices or different people and bestowing this title of leadership removes them in some ways from a zeitgeist, from a moment, from a feeling that is mobilized by a community.
Yeah, thanks. To dovetail of like what you were saying, like about Ptuma, there's this idea called massive addressability, which is a very interesting idea. Is like the idea of disseminating an artifact, whether it's an artwork or a message, to the largest audience possible. And today we have that through the internet. Music videos, for example, are a great example of massive addressability. Cultural leadership. I've always felt like I'm moving counter to the current. In fact, I value moving against culture rather than going with the flow of things. I think culture is not your friend. That's how I've always felt about it. Yeah, cultures get made and destroyed like all the time, you know, like when I think about colonialism, like my culture was almost eviscerated into extinction. So like I'm not very comfortable with the idea of culture. Yeah, in fact, like I prefer to move backwards rather than like sort of like look into the future, or rather like I prefer to have a diachronic in the sense that I'm moving backwards and forwards in time at the same time. Like if you think about my work, Zibuile Zinkisi, it's like an AR work of like Nkisi or
Kensani,
like an African fit.
you. We keep losing you. Do you think, are you able to hear us?
Doll, people, you know, working with computers, Bakongo, general, yeah. Oh no. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Just someone confirm?
Yes, we can hear you
Okay.
now. Good.
Yeah, so like I believe in generating, yeah, so in summary, I believe in generating culture more than following culture. I think culture is something that should continually be generated. And I think maybe that's what leadership is, right? Like leadership maybe is creating a pathway, a scuttleban, as Ikshan Adams would call it, or a desire line, like for other people to follow that you've created, you know. But like for me, I don't feel like culture is our friend. I don't feel like culture is kind. And I think our responsibility is to create actually a plurality of cultures instead of conforming to a culture. You know, like that's what I would subscribe to. I would subscribe to a more pluralistic.
We've lost you again there. I think you were wrapping up that thought on a more pluralistic cultural identity, perhaps. I hope I got that right from you, Kensani, and we hope to get you back. Yes, okay. And that's a very it's a very current conversation.
For generating a future. Yeah. I hope that made sense.
Generating a future. I got that part. Maybe we could ask you to turn your camera off when you're speaking next time, just so that we can get your words. as they're really poignant. And I think what you've raised now around a shift in, and this isn't necessarily everybody's desire or will. Heritage is important to many, many, many people. And yeah, as we move forward, we need to also know and see and acknowledge various points of perspective and view. What you are also speaking about, which is really important, is what we're starting to really see in a digital space. And that digital map starts to shape things quite differently from a cultural perspective. And that's a really, it's a new frontier, particularly when it comes to culture, particularly when it comes to shaping. As group millennial, which is where we're all positioned, right at the start, all of you on this call, not so much, but it is a real reconfiguration, I think, with the digital arena and the digital landscape that allows us to shape things differently. I'd love to hear from Phokeng and Sana around some of the things that have started to emerge here. Cultural leadership, digital. I know a lot of you are playing in that space. Phokeng, let's hear.
Actually, before I go, Lavinia, I really want to hear from Sana, because I feel like your space, the space that you run in Zambia is an island, almost, so to speak. So in that kind of ecosystem, it's so you can easily become identified as a cultural leader because of the space of you run and how it's situated and what kind of ecosystem is situated. So before I go, can I really hear what Sana has to say? And
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phokeng. No, there's a lot of things that was said that I totally agree with in terms of how you were trying to I guess, give us different ideas of what a cultural leader looks like. And the one that I can say that I identify with is the one that's looking at provocation and looking at how we counter something through art. And that's what my intention was always with Everyday Lusaka. And in the context in which I work, and even though we're landlocked, it is an island. It is quite, Zambia is quite far away and quite far removed from the general discourse about art in Africa. But the work I did and the way that I started in 2018, I suppose had a really big impact from what I understand, because it was not something that was done in the same way. So for me, it's about provoking, it's about really countering and really looking at my work and how I relate to Zambia and my identity and facilitating that understanding through these projects that I run. So as much as it's a community project, the way I run it is a lot to do with how I identify and how I try to understand what it looks to look like, what it means to look like me, identify the way I do, speak the language that I do, and also have a disconnect, as well to the land, to Zambia, but also looking at the different identities that exist. The Palestinian Zambians, the Lebanese Zambians, the Somali Zambians, the Kenyan Zambians, the Zambians, whatever it is, however you identify, how do I use photography, images from the past to create a contemporary archive for future generations. So for me, the reason I went with this approach of photography is because it's what I understood about myself. It's how I understood myself and my heritage and my Indianness. So how was I now going to facilitate that for others? So it's like what Nkasani was saying about the future generation, like what happens for the future. And it's in this idea of moving back and forth. I can't remember the word you used, but it made me think of the word of transtemporal. So it's really time traveling. So Everyday Lusaka is the umbrella project that looks at contemporary everyday photographs and the image, whereas Zambia Belonging looks at the past, but it's contextualizing it for the present generation and the future. So if I were deciding to have children, if my friends were deciding to have children, they're of different identities. How do they see themselves and allow themselves to be seen and represented in these very counter archive institutions that are now coming up. Mine's not the only one. I'm really glad to see there's a lot of other projects happening in Zambia. But we have a lot of work to do as Zambia in relation to what I've seen happening in South Africa and the wonderful things that I've seen you all do. We have our own work cut out for us in our own context, but the models that are followed in South Africa have to be a little bit, I think, edited in the Zambian context. But yeah, that's my understanding of cultural leadership in context of like what I do. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's awesome to hear that. Pokeng, are you ready to jump in?
Yes, I am. So, thank you so much, Sada, for that, because I was trying to figure out how do I make sense of, the two different ecosystems. Only last week we were having a conversation about the Cape Town ecosystem and the Joburg ecosystem. So now factoring in the Lusaka ecosystem, it's a different other kettle of fish. But Kensani, I actually want to say something to what you said about to reject culture. First, you have to. I disagree with that a little bit, with your position, because you have to understand what you reject before you can reject it, So I feel like we're still trying to make sense of this burgeoning art environment. So what is it that you're rejecting in actual fact? And then two things about me. Like, I feel like I identify with the cultural leadership as provocation and cultural leader as a title, because most of us Black people, we find ourselves in a position where we're the first people in our family to attain a certain position. So by virtue of that alone, you find yourself being in the forefront of a lot of things. And in most cases, you're not prepared. I myself have been in a situation where I wasn't prepared for whatever, circumstance I found myself in by virtue of the work that I was doing. So in that case, I feel like it is a title that can get, given to you because of the work that you do. And the reason why I identify with cultural leadership as provocation is because for me in the work that I do, I always try to, I guess I'm an independent curator. So what comes to me, sometimes I don't have a choice. And then in most cases, when I do have a choice of what work I want to do, I don't have the funding. So, or the means to make that work possible. So I try to put myself in whatever project that I do and to drive the idea as far as possible, still have, show integrity to myself and to the project itself. So, but yeah, I think just to finalize, like I said when I introduced myself, I'm a cultural worker and I feel like the work should lead and then the rest will follow.
The work should lead and the rest will follow. Absolutely. And there are lots of different ways to come to that place. And there's different methodologies. There's different ways of doing that. I'm always interested in the question, and Faye, you touched on this a little bit earlier around who are you making work for? And if we think about that space of to lead, right? If you are leading something, you're provocating something, you have that curiosity, you're starting to kind of go, well, I'm not just accepting this or that. We are interrogating, we're pulling apart and then rebuild or make or deconstruct. Kensani, you spoke a lot about that today and yesterday. Who are you making work for? Faye, can I hear from you? And sorry, and I did address.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something like
yes.
That I don't like the word deconstruction. I actually prefer the word exhumation, right? Like digging up, like excavation, like digging things up. Like there was a comment here on YouTube about this tendency of forming culture as a monolith. And that's what I mean, like by saying like culture is not our friend, because I don't like, like there's something imperial about the idea of culture, like something universalist, and it doesn't create space for the diversity, for the multiplicity. And in my culture, like multiplicity is incredibly important. I'm a multiplicity, like how we greet each other, we say dumelang, like as opposed to like the English language, which just says hello. So it's sort of like this acknowledgement of an individual as a multiplicity. Like as I'm standing here, it's not just about Kensani, You know what I'm saying? It's about my family. It's about my sister. It's about my ancestors. It's about those that are going to come after me. You know, like, so like there's no stability in that space. And I know, like, sort of like Western notions like sort of value stability. Like, I don't value stability. I value chaos. I value uncertainty, because that's where that's a generative space for me. You know, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. And chaos comes from exhumation, because you never know what you're going to find beneath the ground, you know. So yeah, I'm a cultural anthropologist. that's that's how I would call myself, maybe, if I was to use the word yeah, like, as opposed to cultural leader, I would say cultural anthropologist. Yeah,
words are important. Words are important.
Yeah,
and identities are important, and how we identify with that.
Yeah, the world is made of words. Yeah.
So Pokeng, bring it.
No, I was just saying, I thought we're talking about culture as a working concept, not culture as hegemony. We in this chat as practitioners. So I'm approaching the question as, you know, how do I think about culture as cultural work, not culture as hegemonic? So I feel like Kensani's rejection of culture, he's rejecting culture as hegemony. And I'm talking about culture as practice. So I think that needs to be cleared up also in the discussion.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Can we move on to the next question and put that all that delicious provocation within this context, because there's a lot to chew on there. I'm down for another conversation with all four of you. And I want to go to the question around, who are you making work for, regardless of how you identify with this word culture? You're makers in whatever capacity. So Faye, you spoke about community earlier. Do you want to unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think also might be provocative. I think that so many times we have a lot of people focusing on the artists and the artist's message. And I think that I really think, again, that culture is also created through people having ownership and being able to say, I like this is my favorite book and this is why, or I like this painting and this is what it evokes from me or in me, and what that means. But I think it's also about being deliberate, I suppose. So when I was so in 2020, I produced The Shopping Dead, which was a WhatsApp theater production, but essentially it was an experiment. And it was driven from me being like, okay, a lot of people are wanting to put performing arts work and stream them online. However, as you can even see here with the Zoom, if you have an unstable connection, it's difficult for you to really sit and watch this hour piece or 90-minute piece. Data is expensive. You know, there were so many things that I thought, looking at the South African population, I was just like, how is streaming going to be effective, and how is it going to reach the people who are actually our audiences? But at the same time, you would see people sending messages, like conspiracy theories over WhatsApp. You know, you'd get 19-minute voice notes from someone you have no idea who's speaking. I saw the proliferation of the community action networks, so the CAN networks. And so the question was then, how do we use then our cell phones, which seem to be something that South African audiences are using, and within this this space there are elements of storytelling, which a voice note is. There are elements of community. There are certain elements that we can use to speak to the people that we want to reach. And I think that those kinds of questions and those kinds of provocations is how I approach every project. I'm like, okay, if these are the people that I want to reach and speak to, how can I make it easier for them, and how do I include them in whatever my output is? Yeah.
So culture is collective?
I think culture is collective, but also just it's a thing that you should want the audience to be able to speak about your thing to somebody else. So like once you walk out of a gallery space, right? Somebody shouldn't be like, oh my gosh, the only way that I can tell somebody about it is if I look up a link. People should be able to have their own the language and the impulse to explain whatever they've experienced and to share that with other people.
Thank you very much. You've brought a very important point to this conversation. It's experiential, it's lived, it's active, it's live, and it's collective. It's me and other. And so considering that, does anybody else want to speak about who they make work for before we segue into the good old funding conversation a little bit as well? Who do you make work for? Why? I mean, maybe the why is a long conversation, but who?
Maybe I can chime in here. For me, from the beginning, when I started these platforms, it was for everybody. I know that that's like in a marketing business thing is very like broad and it's like, oh, you're supposed to identify your audience. But with the type of imagery that I was seeing disseminated and like how little representation I was seeing of like everyday Lusaka scenes that we could all relate to, it was for everybody. Those who are locals, those who are tourists, those who are expats, those who want to visit Lusaka. What can we put out there? It was really a very big moment for me to go into doing that, because I had just come from studying in the UK, where seeing a lot of people were like asking very ignorant questions about what it means for me to live in Zambia. And when I came back, I was like, okay, why I can understand why this is a stereotype or like a vision of it, because what we're putting out is feeding into this stereotype, it's feeding into this thing. So how do I now search and exhume? And Kasani said, exhume images and dig up images from online, from the digital platforms, from Flickr, mobile photography, and really dig from pictures from the past and share that and be like, well, this is actually what we're doing. This is what Lusaka looks like. And this is what I am putting value to as locals, as local Lusakans who are taking photographs. This is what I deem valuable and that I want to counter. You know, it's countering also not just what we see from the West, but also what's happening within here. The commercial photography we see, like, you know, wedding stuff, fashion stuff, but sort of being like, cool, this is happening, but how do we document ourselves for ourselves, as well as by proxy, it sort of gives the outside world an understanding of who we are. So for me, it's everybody. And also just to speak on what Faye was talking about, community and being inclusive, and talking about the importance of words. I came across this theory just earlier this year called inclusionism. Inclusionism is the thought that individuals are at their best when they can identify with the community, and communities are at their best when they identify all their individuals. So when I came across this theory and this framework, it really just really contextualized everything that I'm doing, because I was like, wow, it seems very basic. The understanding of it seems very basic, but I was like, this gives me a framework to run Everyday Lusaka, to run Zambia Belonging, because that's exactly what I'm doing, is to identify and make space for all individuals in order for the community to be at its best. So yeah, I think that might be an interesting one for all of us to sort of look at after this chat, this idea of inclusionism. And yeah, that's how I approach the work I do. It is for everybody today and tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you. May I please go? Thank you for that input, Sana, because something came to mind that I'm trying to look for now on my phone. That who said it again? Oh man, I can't find it now. But like basically, Senghor says, for every civilization, the point of departure is the universal. You know, so like when you're talking about, you know, like the community should be able to identify itself in the individual and vice versa. So from the universal, then you think about the particular. So I just thought about those ideas. But then to what your question, Lavinius, I think it's a really good question, because it made me wonder, who actually am I doing the work that I'm doing for? Because I haven't been in a position where I have been able to choose my own projects yet. So it makes me wonder, am I chosen then to do these projects for others? You know what I mean? So it's like, it's a bit of a dilemma, because I wonder if I were able to dictate which projects I take on, would that then make my work individualistic? And since I'm being approached to make projects, does that, I think that gives it more of a collective like function in a sense. So it's a really good question. So I'm actually asking myself these questions as like, thank you for bringing that question forward.
But then, what makes you say yes to these projects other than hunger?
It's hunger. That's why I'm like, you know, so if I could choose, would I do them? But then because I do them, I mean, they have the impact that they have. So it makes me wonder, is something else working through me, you know?
Maker's gotta make.
Yeah, but like that's very interesting for me, because so like I have a job, right? Like I have a day job. And the reason why I have a day job is so I can do whatever I want to do. That's like my primary reason. It's not that I want a job. Like even as an artist and as a curator, it allows me, outside of like my workplace, it allows me to do whatever I please. Because I think it's difficult. Like when you come from a place like Joburg, like where a lot of the cultural practice is led by politics of the stomach, right? It's sort of like you have to do something because you have to get by, you know? And I saw that happening in my life, and I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. Like if I want to wait if I want to get 11 residency rejections, you know, before I get a yes, you know, I was like, I don't want to choose between like bathing, you know, turning on my geyser and cooking, you know, because it takes up electricity, and I'm just like waiting for, you get what I'm saying? So like it's very difficult. Like I get what Puking is saying, like, and I relate to that so much. It's sort of like what do you do in spaces like that? But I think the beauty of it is the improvisational, is the collaborative aspect of it. And I think those are the things that I miss. Like it's sort of like now, yeah, like I don't get to collaborate like much, you're right? Like I don't get to like work with people like as much as I would like to. So it's quite strange, like this balance, achieving like that balance of yeah.
If I can ask a question
I hope
there,
I'm eloquent.
are you saying that you were more collaborative when you were working within the arts system or the arts?
Yeah, when I didn't have a job.
When you didn't have a job.
Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of miss it now, if I'm completely honest. Like I miss being like yeah, working with people. I miss that. Yeah, because now it's sort of like a lot of my work is exported. Like Pugang knows, like, and I complain to him about it all the time. Like, you know, like now, like I'm leaving the country, and I have like multiple shows in Europe. Like I haven't had a show in South Africa in like 2 years. You know what I'm saying? Except at my workplace. And that's like very disturbing. Like for me, like that's incredibly disturbing. Like how much my work gets exported, because that's the only place I can get money from. Like I can only get money literally from outside the country, or Fagogezi, which is never going to fund me again, because I've done 2 residencies with them. So I know like it's over for the next 10 years at least, you know. I'm sorry, but yeah, like it's very hard, man. It's crazy. Like it disturbs me a lot.
So what the audience would not have seen while Kensani was speaking was that all the panelists were nodding and smiling at the comments around, I have my day job and it allows me the autonomy within my artistic practice. And I don't have to choose which part of my world I need to resource. Because I'm not a full-time artist. So Faye, do you want to comment there?
I just want to comment on the fact that like capitalism makes hunger look normal. So I think we should talk more in depth about like how we get funded and what kind of work we've done. But I want to say that like hustle culture, for example, I remember when I was growing up, like people didn't have multiple, like, okay, some people had multiple jobs, but you know, your parents were expected to have one job. But now we live in a world where people are always like, what's your side hustle? Like, what do you do on the side? Like, what other streams of income do you have? And so this idea that you should be working doing 3 or 4 different things, juggling whatever, is seen as the norm for creating a good life. Whereas 20 years ago, it was not considered, it wasn't necessarily considered normal. It was frowned upon, to knowing that people had to work that hard to live, right? And so we're living in a world where that's expected. If you are doing one thing, people are wary of you, and they're just like, how else are you getting the money? You're almost shadier if you just have one job and are making money.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Lavinia, you want to, can I go? Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah,
Okay.
just having a, like I was in a position a few years ago where I had a day job. It's not a day, like I used to work 20 hours a week at that job, and it was a really fulfilling job. But then at some point I realized that, yeah, I can't sustain this. Like, I feel like, you know, the question of autonomy, like, what's going on here? Like, whose story are you propelling? Which narrative? Because you can't choose when you're inside an institution. You're dictated to, and you have to follow the brief. So yeah, I mean, as much as day jobs are great, and like they finance our lifestyles, and maybe we can buy material, and like we're in a comfortable position to imagine new work, but then they also do something to us which is not productive. So the other side of the coin is that you end up being independent, broke most of the time, but then you have a well of ideas, and it's like, you know, but no one is looking in your direction most of the time. So it's a dilemma.
It's a very real dilemma. And it's one of the things that we really wanted to address in this conversation. We're not going to come up with all the solutions. There's no way, but there is certainly an impact on your well-being, on the choices you make about your future, as individuals, as perhaps family members, in deciding to follow a particular pathway. And the hustle mentality is normalized. That is where we're at. The juggle is real, and the days are short. And collaboration takes time. It's critical. It takes time. And so that tension between all these places and spaces, my question to all of you, and I know that across Africa, it's not the same. The funding landscape is vastly different when it comes to the arts. And I don't want to paint this conversation with the South African brush when it comes to funding opportunities, because I know I've said it to all of you a few times, but not to the audience, that funding opportunities in South Africa for artists are still greater than funding opportunities for artists on most of the continent, unless it's international funding, which Kensani, you've spoken about. And then what does that do to one's art making? How many artists do we lose because there isn't a means to sustain oneself in the country that you live in, or the country that you choose? So it's extraordinarily challenging. What are some of our solutions? We have very small audiences. We have very small markets in this country. We would like to hope that the opportunities through a relative digitization and connecting to global markets creates a new audience and a new market. I think some artists have seen the fruits of that. I think most artists have not, realistically. And so how does place funding reliance on your livelihood because you want to be a full-time artist impact you, and for some of you, your families as well?
I mean, in my experience, so I primarily, like most people, actually, I get this question a lot, like, how do you get funding for your project? And so, you get like platforms like Vanza, Res Artist, Rhizome, like globally. And I think it's sort of like the path goes both ways. Like artists need to better articulate their work. Cultural producers need to host workshops actually to help people put together proposals. Like I think that's very important. It's something I've been wanting to do for a long time, helping artists and cultural producers and curators put together proposals that are convincing, proposals that can get you funding. Because a lot of the time, like I work with institutions where like I'm like a jury, and I'm supposed to like sort of say this proposal is worth funding, this one is not, this person deserves a residency, this one does not. And what I've like seen is like a huge gap in eloquence, and elocution and talking about your work and what it does, like the functionary. And I think with art, we have a tendency to sort of like throw that out, like the idea of function, the idea of purpose. What does this thing do? What are you doing? How is it supposed to shape things? So I would say that the question of funding would start there. It would be like there's globally, like, and we are global, we have access to the internet, we're so privileged for the world to be so open for us, and like we need to like acknowledge that and humble ourselves, and we say we need to humble ourselves because of how, when you speak to older artists back in the day, they will tell you that it was so much harder, like, and you were saying, Lavinia, like in South Africa, it's different, like from the rest of Africa, you know what I'm saying, in terms of like access. But I think we'd had to start at the ground and like really helping people like articulate themselves and articulate their projects so that the opportunities for fund to raise the chances of them getting funding, like being on the other side, seeing applications, it's almost treacherous, like it's almost infuriating, actually. Yeah, it's like learn how to put a budget together, learn how to, like those kinds of things, the fundamentals, so I think it's an educational gap. Yeah,
I agree. I think there is an educational gap, and I think that there needs to be a much more diverse way in which those that are providing resources and access to opportunities ask artists to respond to calls. I think making assumptions that everybody should be able to do like a one-pager kick-ass descriptor of your project is also, it is fundamental organization of the way of thinking and the way of expressing oneself. So I think there's a lot of work funders need to do as well, but that's from my previous life. Sana, you have something to say. Please jump in.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, Kasani, because it's something that I encourage the students that I'm lecturing at the moment to be comfortable about talking about their work, but also receiving criticism about their work, because then it allows them to strengthen and become more eloquent in communicating and writing. And I also want to touch on what Lavinia was saying earlier about South Africa sort of having I see South Africa's art industry as an island on its own outside of Africa, because it has such a different approach to Zambia. And one thing I wanted to mention is that a lot of the things that come across as very inclusive in terms of like South African funding opportunities, or rather funding opportunities that occur from South African institutions that are meant to be open to the rest of the continent, I have seen a very big sort of disparity in including people who are not from South Africa who are applicants. So same thing with Bakugesi. I was one of the shortlisted finalists as well, but because the content I was sharing was not relating to the South African context, I was not selected. But that was not a prerequisite, right? So if it was, I probably wouldn't have spent all that time applying and coming up with a budget. So for me, I've noticed that, and it's not like a complaint and like, oh, our problems for funding should be the South African problem, like the problem for South African institutions. It's about what the person on Facebook has been saying. It's we need to come, as Zambians specifically, have a bit more pride. So actually quite oppositional to what you're saying about humbling yourself. People in Zambia don't have that pride. And this is what other people are also seeing. People who are commenting and watching this are like, yes, we don't see enough of ourselves being like, actually, we can do this. We have seen people doing this and getting far and getting to international art fairs and having the opportunity to be in Europe for most of the time and not be disgruntled about not being shown locally because it's completely oppositional here. But my approach as well is to always make sure the work is being seen first at home and then look at like going international or going continental. But for the Zambian context, the funding, there can be a bit too much of a reliance, and I do have a problem with that just because of how generally aid has become such a dependent thing for a lot of institutions here, art or not art. But there is sort of, at the same time, like a lack of inclusion, I find, as people from Zambia who are applying, and therefore not even a chance to learn how to apply for proposals because people are like, oh, are we even going to get it? You know, like, what examples have we seen of funding happening? For me, for the thing that the first and the last funding application that I got and received was with Prohefesha last year. And I was also surprised. I was like, wow, this happened. I was like, okay, cool. Now I have to do the work. Now I actually have to use this funding and actually do what I signed up to do. So that's my little bit on sharing how different it is for South Africans than for Zambians, and how really I get it's your own context, but it's very much like from us sitting out, it's like, wow, there's a lot going on out there, and they're doing it, and like it's almost like a model for people in Zambia to be like, wow, how come South African music and movies and like, you know, superstars and art is so known to us, but Zambian art and Zambian people and Zambian like practitioners are not being seen. What are we doing or not doing to be seen? You know?
Well, South Africa got a lot of funding, I think, firstly because so people are also putting Nigeria into the chat, and people also bring up Kenya, right? But they're seen as economic hubs on the continent. So the thing is, like, even the fact that they're getting recognized internationally, they're recognized internationally because of their economic stronghold within the continent. And like South Africa is declining a little bit. Kenya is booming, especially in the tech space and the startup industry. And so we might see more of a shift. I don't know, but I'm definitely seeing more Kenyan artists than they used to be, right? But I was also going to say, in terms of funding, it's interesting that the arts is like, you have to be everything for everyone. Like I hear Kensani's chat about art being functional. But again, it comes to like functional for who and for what. So also there are models where like, you know, people might do communal games or they might draw on their house, but that is artistic and it's there. And we're like, hey, look at this thing. And in Europe, they're like, let's put this in a museum. And so we're sitting there like, why would you put this pretty thing in it's supposed to be used. But the value of that object is really about its untouchability, and it's limiting that access, right? And so when you're talking about function and functionality, I'm wondering how you're positioning that. I know that people get, so there's art as something that is inaccessible to the community. Then you have art funding that is all about, but art is just good to do, right? Like everyone should just write, just paint, just dance, get these people together, dance, right? And then, so there's funding that just looks at that. And then there's also funding where people are like art is something that's very spiritual. And I think that having so it can talk to the multiplicities of what art is, but I think it also becomes then harder for people to put an economic kind of like placing on art, because art is expected to do all these things for everybody. Yeah.
Amen. There is, thank you for that, Faye. This is a very big rabbit hole to start to excavate. And it's also embedded in our history, our recent history, and our history that goes back quite a bit further than that. We are, it's really fascinating to see how many South African artists do not tour their art in Africa. It's known that it's limited. And it's also a really interesting tension between should art always be funded, and how do we maintain livelihoods for ourselves as practitioners if it's not funded? And whose responsibility is it? These are big questions that a lot of people are grappling with right now. I see there are 2 minutes left. And so I would really like each of you to just take 30 seconds, please. Final point, something that's important to you as we wrap this up. Kensani. Okay, Pokeng, and then Kensani, then Sana, then Faye.
Just to wrap up my portion for this afternoon, I think in relation to the funding question, in relation to the whole theme of the conversation, I think on a ground level, we also have to be very streetwise, see what's going on around you. And I'm not saying you should sell yourself to the devil or anything, but like, you know, if people are making products, think about how you can, you know, not make products, but how you can make the work that you do lucrative. Because waiting for funding is quite passive, and Africa has a history of being handed things, you know, so you don't want to reproduce that, because that comes with a lot of like, you know, attachments, and you maybe don't want that. So I think people can catch you along the way. Do your own thing, people will find you along the way. So that's what I want to end up with. Thank you.
I'm gonna be corny and end it with a proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. There you go.
I think you both have said where my politics lie with working in the industry. We don't all make it none of us make it unless we all make it. And also, don't make a habit of relying on handouts. Do your own stuff. Your work will speak for itself. People will see value in it and will be like, I want to pay you. I want to sponsor you. So let your work speak for itself and work together, not against each other. That's what I think. Corny, very corny, yes.
I am a product of this culture. I'm a product of right now, and that means that we all hustling. You see us here. This is also just like one step in our journey to do whatever we want to go to next. We don't have answers. Okay, let me not speak for them. I don't have answers. But hustle, and hopefully we'll make it together. That's it.
My last word is collaborate, and which is, I think, what everyone is speaking about here. Collaboration is key, and putting your hand up as well. There is a whole community of art makers and practitioners and cultural producers that are there that can support. It has been an honor and a privilege. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, for being with us. Big up to Artfluence, and hope we see more of the talks in the next few days. Thank you, everybody. Take care and be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Think moments and memories. make magic and movies shared between sons and daughters, or just friends in their quarter. More music, more movement, more space for amusement, where history was made and the future is paved. Adventure awaits. Together, embraced, just down the highway. Think Midlands, my way.